When I first opened my mouth to ask for help with tuition, I thought it would be simple. I thought my parents, the people who had raised me, would understand. After all, I wasn't asking for extravagance, just a little support. A hand to steady me while I navigated a future that already felt heavy on my shoulders. Instead, their answer came quietly, without a tremor of emotion, yet it cut deeper than any angry outburst ever could. Be independent. Those words echoed in my head long after the conversation ended. I stared at my empty hands, imagining what it would feel like to hold that help they refused to give. But the reality was simple. There was no money, no reassurance, no compassion. Just a cold expectation that I would fend for myself, as though their love had conditions attached. At first, I felt shock. How could they, my own parents, look at me and say that? I remember sitting in my room, the soft hum of the ceiling fan above me, my chest tight with disbelief. I wanted to argue, to plead, to cry, but my voice felt small, brittle. Instead, I nodded silently, forcing a smile I didn't feel. Yes, I will be independent, I whispered to myself, though inside I felt abandoned. The following weeks were brutal. I found myself juggling odd jobs I had never imagined I could do. I delivered packages, worked in a cafe until my feet ached, and cleaned offices late into the night. My textbooks and notes were my only companions, and even they seemed heavy, weighted with the knowledge that I was alone in this struggle. Every time I looked at my friends, supported and cheered on by their families, I felt a pang of bitterness and sorrow. They didn't know the emptiness of being told to fend for yourself when you were barely 18, and trying to hold onto a dream. But slowly, something shifted inside me. Pain, I realized, could either break you or forge you into something stronger. I refused to let their words define my worth. Every paycheck I earned, every sleepless night I endured, I whispered, I will show you. I will rise. The sting of rejection became fuel, and the loneliness transformed into determination. I built a world where I depended only on myself, where failure was a teacher and perseverance became a companion. Still, the emotional wounds were real. There were nights when I sat in the dark, my head in my hands, imagining a life where I had been supported, encouraged, loved without condition. Those dreams felt like luxuries, cruel reminders of what I had been denied. I hated myself sometimes for being weak, for wanting something so simple as guidance and help. But underneath that hatred, a seed of something powerful began to grow, a hunger for self-reliance that no one could take from me. And in that hunger, there was also clarity. I saw my parents differently now, not just as my caregivers, but as human beings capable of failure, of coldness, of setting boundaries that wounded. I began to understand that their idea of love was harsh, wrapped in the language of independence and self-sufficiency. I would take their lesson, unwillingly given though it was, and turn it into my own strength. Be independent, they had said. And so I would, but I promised myself that when the time came, they would see the result of their words. A person who survived, thrived, and would never need to beg for help again. That night, lying in my small, dimly lit room, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not hope, not bitterness exactly, but a quiet, determined resolve. I would be independent, yes. But one day, that independence would speak louder than any word they had ever said to me. The years that followed were a crucible, each day testing the limits of my endurance. I learned the hard way that independence was not a gift. It was a relentless teacher, one that demanded sacrifice at every turn. College became a battlefield, my tuition and living expenses mine alone to navigate. I worked 2 part-time jobs, sometimes 3, juggling shifts with classes and assignments. Sleep became a stranger, and leisure a forbidden luxury. I watched the world of my peers unfold with ease, their parents cheering them on, funding internships and offering safety nets. And I learned to swallow the bitterness, channeling it into focus, discipline, and a quiet, simmering determination. Each paycheck I earned, no matter how small, felt like a victory. I celebrated in private, with no one to share my triumphs. I learned to budget meticulously, stretching each dollar with the precision of a surgeon. I memorized the cafeteria specials, scoured thrift stores, and learned the art of cooking simple, filling meals. Every choice I made was guided by the dual forces of necessity and determination. My independence had become a fortress, built brick by brick from sweat, tears, and exhaustion. But the solitude was relentless. There were nights when the silence of my apartment pressed in on me, a tangible reminder that I was doing everything alone. I felt the ache of absence, the absence of encouragement, of comfort, of someone who would tell me, "You can do this. I believe in you." Instead, I had only the echo of their words, "Be independent." I carried them like stones in my chest, a constant weight that refused to be ignored. Yet in the loneliness, I discovered parts of myself I might never have known. I discovered resilience, the ability to push forward when every bone ached and every nerve screamed. I discovered resourcefulness, the creativity to solve problems on my own, to make do with less, to turn scarcity into opportunity. I discovered patience, the understanding that progress is rarely dramatic, often invisible, and measured in small, almost imperceptible increments. And most importantly, I discovered pride, not the pride that seeks approval from others, but a quiet, unshakable pride in surviving, in thriving against odds stacked impossibly high. Scholarships became my lifeline, each one a validation that my efforts were not in vain. I wrote essays that poured my soul onto paper, detailing struggles no one had wanted to hear but that I refused to hide. I applied for internships, often unpaid, because experience was currency and knowledge was power. I networked, learned, failed, and learned again, constructing a path that was entirely mine. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world began to open to me. Doors that had seemed locked finally creaked open. Opportunities appeared, and I seized them with the tenacity of someone who knew what it meant to be denied. Even as my life began to take shape, I never forgot the sting of that first conversation, the cold dismissal, the demand for independence. It became a compass, guiding me not just in financial matters, but in every relationship, every decision, every choice about who I allowed into my life. I built boundaries where none had existed, fortresses where vulnerability had once been. Independence was no longer punishment, it was power. And yet, beneath the power, beneath the resilience, there remained a flicker of longing. I wanted acknowledgement, not charity, not pity, but recognition of the struggle, the sacrifice. The nights spent studying under dim lights while the world around me slept comfortably. I wanted someone to say, "I see you, and I respect what you've built," for now, that someone was only myself. By the end of those 9 years, I was unrecognizable from the 18-year-old who had whispered, "I will be independent." I was sharper, stronger, wiser. I had learned to survive, and to thrive, without leaning on anyone who had refused to hold my hand when I needed it most. And somewhere in the depths of my heart, a seed of anticipation began to grow, the quiet certainty that one day my independence would have its reckoning. 9 years had passed since that night when their words, "Be independent," echoed through my mind and set me on a path I had never chosen, but had learned to own. 9 years of building a life from scratch, of sleepless nights and quiet victories, of learning to trust no one but myself. I had grown strong, confident, and successful. I had carved out a space in the world that was mine, built entirely on effort and grit. And then the call came. It was a quiet evening, and I was working at my desk, files spread around me, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold. My phone rang, displaying a number I recognized instantly. My parents. My heart tightened not with joy, but with cautious curiosity. Something was wrong. The tone of their conversation confirmed it almost immediately. We need your help," my mother said, her voice trembling. My father remained silent, but I could hear the tension, the desperation behind the words, the medical bills, the debt. "We can't manage it alone." For a moment, I sat frozen, my mind racing. The same people who had told me to be independent were now reaching out for support. The same hands that had let me fend for myself were now asking me to hold them. The injustice burned hot in my chest, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a strange, prickling anticipation. I could feel the old wounds opening, the memories of nights spent starving, studying by candlelight, working until my body ached, all for a future I had to build alone. I remembered the quiet tears I had shed, the humiliation of being ignored, the sting of their rejection. And yet, I was not powerless anymore. I had grown in ways they could never imagine. As I listened to them explain their situation, my emotions tangled in ways I hadn't anticipated. Part of me felt a flicker of pity. Humanity compels us to care, even when we have been wronged. But another part, stronger now, recognized an opportunity. Not cruelty, not malice, but leverage. The power that comes from survival, from having built a life independent of their whims. I didn't speak immediately. I let the silence stretch, letting them feel the weight of it. I imagined their panic, their uncertainty, and it was almost satisfying, not because I wished them harm, but because it mirrored the helplessness I had felt all those years ago. Their dependency was now mine to witness. Finally, I spoke, calm and measured. I hear you. I understand your situation. The words were soft, almost gentle, but underneath was a quiet authority that hadn't existed before. But there are conditions. If you expect my help, you must respect boundaries. There will be no shortcuts, no excuses, no demands. You will meet me halfway, or we will not move forward. I could sense the hesitation on the other end of the line, the realization that the child they had dismissed had grown into someone formidable. The power dynamics had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't pleading. I wasn't dependent. I wasn't a child seeking permission or aid. I was the architect of my life, and they were at the threshold, seeking passage into it. As I hung up the phone, a rush of emotions coursed through me, relief, triumph, and a subtle, intoxicating satisfaction. Revenge was not in anger or cruelty. It was in the shift, the reversal of roles, the quiet acknowledgement that I had survived, thrived, and now held the power they once denied me. For the first time in years, I felt the intoxicating sweetness of true independence. Not just surviving alone, but standing firm, in control, and ready to determine the terms of my own life. Their call was a reminder of the past, but also a herald of the future. And I, finally, was ready to decide what that future would look like. The days after that phone call were heavy with tension, but not the kind that comes from fear or anger. It was the quiet, deliberate weight of power, the kind that comes from knowing you survived what others thought would break you. I had spent 9 years building a life from nothing, and now the world had handed me a chance to assert the strength I had earned. I met them at a small cafe, neutral territory. My parents arrived, faces pale and anxious, as if they were stepping into an unfamiliar world. And in a sense they were. The child they had dismissed years ago now walked with quiet authority, eyes steady, a calmness that was almost unnerving. They looked at me, searching for traces of vulnerability, for weakness, for the scared kid who had once asked for help. But it was gone. I had become someone unrecognizable to them, and that realization shone in their eyes. I understand your situation. I began, voice measured, calm, and I can help. But help comes with responsibility, not just mine, but yours too. I outlined conditions, firm and unwavering. They were simple: honesty, effort, boundaries, and accountability. No shortcuts, no dependence without effort, no demands without respect. They hesitated, perhaps surprised, perhaps realizing for the first time that they could not coerce me or manipulate my kindness. I held my ground, allowing the weight of their own past words, be independent, to settle over them like a mirror reflecting their neglect. The irony was exquisite. All those years of struggle, of lonely nights spent scraping by, of fighting for every small victory, had led to this moment. They had once dismissed me, forced me to fend for myself, and yet now they needed me. But their need was no longer a demand. It was a choice I could shape, define, and govern. That was revenge, not bitterness, not malice, but power reclaimed and exercised with precision. As we walked through the arrangements together, I noticed subtle shifts in their demeanor. Pride turned to humility. Entitlement gave way to gratitude. They were learning, slowly, what it felt like to be on the receiving end of patience and discipline rather than abandonment. And in watching them, I felt something I hadn't anticipated, a sense of closure. The years of hurt, of self, doubt of quiet humiliation, were beginning to find their resolution. By the time our meeting ended, the dynamic had irrevocably changed. I wasn't the child asking for tuition. I wasn't the powerless teenager. I was a person who had survived the coldness of neglect, who had transformed rejection into resilience, and who now held the reins of authority. The revenge was subtle, almost poetic. I gave them help, yes, but on my terms, with the dignity and power I had fought so hard to claim. As I left the cafe, the sunlight warm on my face, I felt a quiet triumph. There was no need for anger, no need for cruelty, no need for shouting or retribution. True revenge had been in the transformation, the shift from helplessness to authority, from dependency to self-mastery. Their call had reopened old wounds, but it had also revealed the depth of my own strength. Walking home, I thought back to that first conversation, to the words that had once felt like a sentence, "Be independent." I smiled softly, almost tenderly, because those words had not broken me. They had forged me, and now independence was no longer a punishment, no longer a burden. It was a triumph, a declaration, a legacy. The sweetest revenge is never about hurting those who wronged you. It is about becoming someone they cannot ignore, someone whose worth cannot be diminished, someone whose life thrives despite their absence of support. That was my revenge, my peace, and my freedom, and for the first time, I truly felt whole.